Supreme Court Justice Anita Carter rarely stepped outside the imposing marble walls of the nation's highest court for anything other than official duties. But today was different. Dressed in a simple navy suit and wearing understated black flats, she blended seamlessly with the crowd entering the small district courthouse in her hometown. There were no reporters following her, no aides trailing behind. Today, Anita was here on her own terms, as a quiet observer. The courthouse was a far cry from the grandeur she was accustomed to. The scuffed linoleum floors and faint smell of old coffee gave the place a utilitarian feel, as though it existed solely to churn through cases as efficiently as possible. But Anita wasn't here to critique the decor. She had come to investigate growing whispers about misconduct in the lower courts. Anonymous letters and internal reports had hinted at a culture of intimidation and corruption. Judges pressured into hasty decisions, clerks harassed into silence, and, most troublingly, accusations that the courthouse's security staff frequently overstepped their authority. Anita had always believed that real change started from the ground up. It wasn't enough to issue mandates or sign rulings from an ivory tower. She needed to see the problems herself, to feel the tension that hung in the air, and understand what those working at the courthouse faced every day. So she left behind her title and prestige, walking into the courthouse as just another face in the crowd. No one noticed her as she quietly slipped into the back row of Courtroom 2, her piercing gaze hidden behind a pair of modest glasses. The day's docket was a mix of small criminal cases and civil disputes. Anita sat silently, taking mental notes on the judge's tone, the lawyers' performances, and the way the defendants were treated. She noticed a young woman representing herself in a civil matter, nervously clutching a folder of documents, while the opposing attorney cut her down with dismissive remarks. The judge barely intervened. Anita's jaw tightened. It was exactly the kind of imbalance of power she had come to witness. As the session neared its midday break, Anita quietly exited the courtroom. Her plan was to walk through the courthouse's restricted areas, filing rooms, judges' chambers, and security offices. These were the places where the unspoken dynamics of power often played out, away from the public eye. But as she moved toward the hallway leading to the employee-only section, her presence did not go unnoticed. Officer Roger Haynes leaned against the wall near the metal detectors, arms crossed over his chest. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, Haynes carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he owned the place. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a gleam, but his demeanor radiated impatience. He had worked this courthouse for over a decade and had developed a reputation for being quick to anger and heavy-handed. In his mind, his job was to keep order, and anyone who didn't fit his perception of who belonged in his courthouse was a potential problem. Haynes's eyes followed Anita as she walked past him. Something about her unnerved him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, not like the nervous defendants or frazzled attorneys he was used to, but with quiet confidence. Or maybe it was the fact that she hadn't made eye contact or offered the kind of deferential nod he expected from people passing through. He straightened up, his boots thudding heavily on the floor as he moved to block her path. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice curt and clipped. "This area is restricted." Anita stopped and turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "I'm aware," she replied evenly. "I won't be long." Haynes frowned. He didn't like her tone. It wasn't rude, but it wasn't apologetic either. "Restricted means restricted," he said, his voice growing sharper. "Do you have clearance to be back here?" Anita paused for a moment, considering her response. She could easily pull out her credentials and put an end to this interaction. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she decided to see how far this man was willing to take his display of authority. "I have a reason to be here," she said simply. "If you're concerned, you can follow up with the court administrator." Haynes's eyes narrowed. Her calmness irritated him. Most people, when confronted by him, stammered apologies or backed away. This woman didn't even flinch. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'm the one in charge of security here. If you don't turn around and leave, I'll have to escort you out." Anita's gaze didn't waver. "I'd advise you to reconsider your tone, officer," she said quietly. "You're making assumptions that might not end well for you." Haynes bristled. To him, her words sounded like a veiled threat, a challenge to his authority. His hand instinctively moved to the baton on his belt. "Is that so?" he sneered. "Well, let me tell you something, lady. Around here you don't call the shots. I do." The tension in the air was palpable. Clerks and attorneys passing through the hallway began to slow down, sensing that something was about to happen. Anita noticed the gathering attention but remained composed. She took a step back, creating space between her and Haynes. "I'm going to continue with my business," she said, her voice steady. "If you feel the need to escalate this, that's on you." Haynes's face flushed with anger. He reached out and grabbed her arm. "You're not going anywhere." The sudden physical contact shocked the onlookers. A few gasps echoed in the hallway. Anita's demeanor shifted. She straightened to her full height, and though she was considerably smaller than Haynes, her presence seemed to expand. "Remove your hand," she said coldly, her voice carrying a weight that made even the most distant bystanders pause. Haynes hesitated for a fraction of a second before tightening his grip. "You're coming with me," he growled, beginning to drag her toward the security office. Anita didn't resist, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. "You don't know what you're doing," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "But you're about to find out." In that moment, Haynes had no idea just how right she was. As Anita Carter felt the firm grip of Officer Haynes around her arm, she maintained her calm exterior, though her mind began working through the implications of what was happening. She had dealt with hostility and power plays before, but the sheer audacity of this man's actions surprised even her. Her objective had been simple: to observe the court's operations without drawing attention. Yet now, she found herself dragged into an unnecessary and hostile confrontation. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something much larger, a system that allowed individuals like Haynes to wield authority unchecked. The hallway had grown quiet except for the echo of Haynes' heavy boots against the linoleum floor as he led Anita toward the security office. A few clerks peeked nervously around corners, their curiosity mingled with apprehension. No one dared to intervene. The courthouse had seen its share of power struggles, but this felt different. The tension was thick, and Anita could sense it lingering in the air like a storm waiting to break. "I'm warning you," Officer Anita said firmly, though her tone remained measured. "You're escalating a situation that doesn't need to exist." Haynes smirked, his grip tightening slightly. "Is that a fact?" he sneered, throwing a glance over his shoulder at her. "Let me guess. You think a few big words and that fancy attitude will get you out of trouble? Not on my watch." Anita said nothing in response, choosing instead to observe him closely. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as though he were performing for an invisible audience. She could see it in his posture, the way his chest puffed out and his jaw clenched. He wasn't just asserting authority, he was indulging in it. They reached the security office, a cramped, dimly lit room cluttered with filing cabinets and outdated surveillance monitors. Haynes pushed the door open with his free hand and practically shoved Anita inside. The door slammed shut behind them, muffling the murmur of voices from the hallway. Anita straightened her jacket, brushing off the indignity of being manhandled, and turned to face him. "Now," Haynes said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction, "why don't you tell me what you were doing snooping around restricted areas? Who sent you? Are you some kind of activist? A journalist? You're not getting past me." Anita tilted her head slightly, studying him as though he were a particularly puzzling case she had to solve. "Activist. Journalist," she repeated, her voice calm but carrying a subtle note of incredulity. "Is that what you think I am?" "I think you're someone who doesn't belong here," Haynes shot back, crossing his arms over his chest. "And I'm not about to let you wander around unchecked, so start talking." Anita allowed a brief silence to linger before responding, choosing her words carefully. "It's interesting," she said, her tone thoughtful, "how quickly you've decided who I am and what my intentions must be. All without asking a single meaningful question." Haynes bristled at her calm defiance. "You don't get to lecture me," he snapped. "This is my courthouse, and I don't take kindly to people breaking the rules." "Your courthouse," Anita repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware you owned the judicial system." "Don't get smart with me," Haynes growled, stepping closer to her. "I've seen plenty of people like you before. You think you can just waltz in here and do whatever you please because you think the rules don't apply to you." Anita's patience, though vast, was beginning to wear thin. She took a deep breath, grounding herself before meeting his gaze head-on. "Officer Haynes, I've tried to give you the benefit of the doubt. I've allowed you to misinterpret my actions and overstep your authority without resistance because I wanted to see how far you'd take this. But let me be very clear, you're on dangerous ground. If you proceed down this path, the consequences will be yours to bear." Her words landed like a cold slap, but Haynes was too entrenched in his own sense of power to recognize the gravity of her statement. Instead, he laughed a harsh, mocking sound that echoed off the drab walls of the office. "Consequences," he repeated, shaking his head. "You've got some nerve, lady. I don't know who you think you are, but you're not scaring me. I've dealt with tougher than you." Anita let his words hang in the air for a moment, then took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. Though she was smaller than him by a considerable margin, her presence seemed to fill the room. "You've made assumptions about me from the moment you saw me," she said quietly, her voice steady and unyielding. "You assumed I didn't belong. You assumed I was a threat. And now you're doubling down on those assumptions because admitting you're wrong is too much for your ego to handle." Haynes' jaw tightened, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face before his defensive anger returned. "Enough of this," he barked. "You're going to sit down, stay quiet, and wait here while I call this in. If you really have clearance to be in restricted areas, someone will back up your story. If not, you're in for a world of trouble." Anita raised an eyebrow. "By all means," she said, gesturing to the phone on the desk. "Make your call." Her calm unnerved him. He reached for the phone, his fingers gripping the receiver tightly as though it were a lifeline. As he punched in the number for his superior, Anita watched him closely. She could see the cracks forming in his confidence, the way his hand trembled ever so slightly as he held the receiver to his ear. "This is Officer Haynes," he said gruffly into the phone. "I've detained someone for unauthorized access to restricted areas. I need verification on whether she's cleared to be here." There was a pause as the person on the other end of the line responded. Haynes' expression shifted subtly, his bravado faltering for a split second before he masked it with a scowl. "Yeah, well, she's being uncooperative," he said, casting a glare in Anita's direction. "I'm holding her in the security office." Another pause. This time, Haynes' scowl deepened, and a bead of sweat formed on his temple. He glanced at Anita, his grip on the receiver tightening. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice a shade quieter than before. All right, fine. He slammed the receiver back onto the cradle and turned to face her, his face a mixture of frustration and disbelief. You think you're clever, don't you? He said, his voice low and dangerous. I don't know how you pulled this off, but it's not over. Anita's expression remained unreadable. What did they tell you? She asked. Haynes hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. Finally, he spat out, they said you're cleared. But I still don't buy it. There's something off about you. Anita's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was no warmth in it. Something off, she repeated. Interesting choice of words. Perhaps you should take a moment to reflect on why you feel that way. Haynes didn't respond. His confidence was unraveling, but his stubbornness refused to let him admit defeat. He turned away from her, muttering under his breath, as Anita stood silently, her presence in the room now utterly commanding. The tide had shifted, and though Haynes didn't yet realize it, he was no longer in control. The tension in the security office was palpable, and though Officer Haynes had reluctantly backed off after his superior confirmed Anita's clearance, his bruised ego refused to let the matter drop. Anita remained calm and composed, standing by the desk with her arms loosely crossed, but her piercing gaze never left him. Haynes paced the small room like a predator, muttering under his breath as he tried to salvage his sense of authority. For a moment, the only sounds were the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead and the creak of his boots on the worn linoleum floor. What exactly is your game here? Haynes finally demanded, spinning around to face her. His voice was low and sharp, his frustration bleeding through every word. You walk in here, strutting around like you own the place, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. And now you expect me to believe that you're just some innocent bystander with clearance. Who the hell are you? Anita met his eyes without flinching, her expression neutral. You seem to have already decided who I am, Officer Haynes, she replied, her voice steady. So why don't you tell me? That response only fueled his irritation further. Don't get smart with me, he snapped, pointing an accusatory finger in her direction. I don't care who vouched for you. There's something you're not telling me, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it. Anita tilted her head slightly, studying him with a calm intensity that made him visibly uncomfortable. She could see it now, the cracks in his bravado, the insecurity lurking just beneath the surface. Haynes wasn't acting out of confidence, he was acting out of fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of losing control, fear of being seen as less powerful than he wanted to appear. But rather than deflate, his fear manifested as aggression, a desperate need to assert himself. I have nothing to hide, she said simply. But you should think carefully about what you do next. Haynes laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that lacked any real humor. You think you're in a position to warn me, he said, taking a step closer to her. Lady, I've dealt with plenty of people like you. You think you're untouchable, that you can walk all over people like me because of who you are or what connections you have. But let me tell you something, in this courthouse, I make the rules. Anita raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanging. Is that so? Damn right it is, Haynes growled. He jabbed a finger toward the chair by the wall. Sit down, now. Anita didn't move. I'm perfectly comfortable standing, thank you. I said. Sit down, he barked, his voice rising. His hand hovered near the baton on his belt, a clear attempt to intimidate her. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the unspoken threat hanging between them like a storm cloud. Anita took a slow breath, holding his gaze. And I said I'm fine where I am. The defiance in her tone was quiet but unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of overt challenge that would provoke an impulsive reaction, but it was enough to send Haynes over the edge. His face darkened with anger, and before Anita could react, he stepped forward and grabbed her arm once more, this time with a bruising grip. "I told you to sit down," he hissed, pulling her roughly toward the chair. The sudden force of the action caused Anita to stumble slightly, but she quickly regained her footing. Her other hand shot out, bracing against the desk to steady herself, and her eyes snapped to his with a fire that made him hesitate for the briefest of moments. She didn't shout or struggle, but the sheer weight of her presence was enough to make the room feel smaller. "Let go of me," she said, enunciating each word with icy precision. Haynes hesitated, his grip loosening ever so slightly. For a moment it seemed like he might back down, but his pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, he tightened his hold and shoved her into the chair with more force than necessary, the legs scraping loudly against the floor as it skidded backward. Anita's hands gripped the armrests to steady herself, her body tense but controlled. She didn't shout, didn't retaliate, but her silence was more powerful than any outburst could have been. She sat upright, her shoulders squared, her gaze fixed on Haynes with an intensity that made his earlier bravado falter. "You're making a very dangerous mistake," she said quietly, "one that you won't be able to undo." Haynes scoffed, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Big words," he muttered. "We'll see how tough you are when you're answering questions downtown." "Downtown," Anita repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You intend to arrest me now? On what grounds?" Interfering with court operations, he snapped, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "Trespassing. Take your pick." Anita let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Interfering with court operations," she repeated. "That's an interesting accusation, considering you're the one disrupting the courthouse by dragging me in here without cause." Haynes' face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. He stiffened, his head snapping toward the sound as though he'd been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to. Anita's expression didn't change, though a faint glimmer of satisfaction flickered in her eyes. "Open the door," she said calmly. "I think you'll want to hear what they have to say." For a moment Haynes didn't move, his hand hovering near the baton on his belt, as though he was considering ignoring the interruption. But the knock came again, more insistent this time, and he let out a frustrated sigh before crossing the room and yanking the door open. A young clerk stood in the hallway, her face pale and drawn. She looked past Haynes and locked eyes with Anita, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Officer Haynes," she said hesitantly, "I was sent to check on the situation." "The situation is under control," Haynes barked, his tone clipped. "You can go back to whatever you were doing." The clerk didn't budge. "I was told to inform you that the presiding judge has been made aware of what's happening," she said carefully. "And, well, he's on his way down." Haynes froze, the color draining from his face. He turned slowly to look at Anita, who remained seated, her expression calm and unreadable. For the first time, real doubt crept into his features. "The presiding judge," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The clerk nodded. "Yes, sir. He said he'd like to speak to her personally." Anita rose from the chair with the same quiet grace she'd displayed throughout the ordeal, brushing off her jacket as though nothing had happened. She stepped past Haynes without so much as a glance in his direction, her gaze fixed on the young clerk. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm and composed. "I think we've wasted enough time here." Haynes opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He stood frozen in place as Anita left the security office, her posture as upright and commanding as ever. The clerk followed close behind, casting a nervous glance over her shoulder at the officer who had just made what was likely the biggest mistake of his career. For Haynes, the weight of his actions was beginning to sink in. He had pushed too far, gone too far, and now there was no undoing it. The storm he had tried so hard to control was about to come crashing down around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As Anita exited the security office, the tension between her and Officer Haynes still hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The hallway seemed to stretch before her, every step a reminder of the path she had chosen to take by coming here today. Haynes didn't follow immediately. He remained rooted in place, his mind racing as the weight of his actions began to press down on him. He was no fool. Despite his impulsiveness, he knew that whatever storm was brewing, he'd placed himself squarely in its eye. The courthouse staff who had witnessed fragments of the scene began to stir. Some tried to look busy, shuffling papers or retreating into side rooms, but their curiosity was evident in their lingering glances. Others exchanged hushed whispers, their eyes darting between Anita and the now silent security office where Haynes stood. For them, this was no ordinary confrontation. Something about Anita's poise and presence had set this moment apart, even if they didn't yet understand why. Anita kept her pace steady, her expression neutral, as she approached the main courtroom floor. She had no interest in escalating the scene further. Haynes had already handed her enough ammunition to make her point, and she wasn't about to squander it with unnecessary dramatics. Still, she could feel the pulse of unease rippling through the courthouse, as though everyone present sensed the gravity of what was happening but couldn't articulate it. Just as she reached the double doors leading back to the courtroom she had quietly observed earlier, they swung open. The presiding judge, a man in his late 60s with a weathered but authoritative face, stepped through. His robe swept the ground as he moved, and his sharp, analytical eyes quickly found Anita in the hallway. Behind him trailed a senior clerk, her hands clutching a tablet that she seemed too nervous to even glance at. The judge stopped abruptly, his gaze narrowing as he took in the scene. "Ms. Carter," he said, his deep voice breaking the silence. There was no question in his tone, only a statement of fact. "I understand there's been a situation." Anita allowed herself the faintest of smiles, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "Judge Mason," she greeted him, inclining her head slightly. "I didn't expect to see you down here personally." Judge Mason didn't smile back. His eyes flicked briefly to the security office behind her, where Haynes had just emerged, his face flushed and his expression one of poorly concealed panic. The judge's gaze lingered on him for a moment, a flicker of disapproval crossing his features before he returned his attention to Anita. "I was informed that there was some confusion regarding your presence in the courthouse," he said, his tone carefully measured. "I hope this misunderstanding hasn't caused you undue inconvenience." Anita raised an eyebrow, her composure as unshakable as ever. "A misunderstanding is one way to describe it," she replied, "though I suspect it goes deeper than that." Judge Mason's jaw tightened slightly, and he glanced once more at Haynes, who was now slowly making his way down the hallway, his shoulders hunched and his steps hesitant. The presiding judge waited until the officer was within earshot before speaking again, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Officer Haynes," he said, each word enunciated with deliberate precision, "would you care to explain why Justice Carter was detained and removed from her observations in such an unprofessional manner?" Haynes froze mid-step, his eyes widening in shock. For a moment, the hallway fell silent, the weight of Judge Mason's words hitting everyone present like a thunderclap. Whispers broke out among the clerks and attorneys who had been lingering nearby, their quiet conversations now filled with disbelief. "Justice Carter," someone murmured. "Did he just say Supreme Court Justice Carter?" The color drained from Haynes' face as the realization of his error settled fully upon him. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. His usual bravado, his sharp tongue, all of it had deserted him in an instant. Instead, he stammered incoherently, his gaze darting between Anita and Judge Mason, as though searching for an escape route. I didn't know, Haynes finally managed, his voice hoarse. She didn't say who she was. Judge Mason's eyes hardened. And did you think to ask before you laid hands on her and dragged her into a security office like a common criminal? Haynes flinched at the venom in the judge's tone. She was in a restricted area, he muttered weakly, his attempt to defend himself sounding pitiful even to his own ears. I thought, you thought. Anita interjected, her voice calm but cutting, that my presence here was a threat to your sense of control. You didn't ask questions. You didn't seek clarification. You acted out of arrogance and bias, assuming you could treat me however you pleased because you didn't like the way I looked or the way I carried myself. Her words were like a scalpel, precise and unrelenting, slicing through Haynes' flimsy excuses. The crowd that had gathered in the hallway seemed to hold its collective breath, their eyes fixed on Anita as she continued. This isn't just about me, she said, her voice carrying a quiet but undeniable power. How many others have you treated this way? How many people have been on the receiving end of your aggression simply because you assumed they didn't belong? This isn't a misunderstanding, Officer Haynes. This is a pattern. Judge Mason's expression remained stern, but there was a glimmer of respect in his eyes as he watched Anita speak. He turned to Haynes, his tone cold and unforgiving. Officer, your actions today have not only humiliated a justice of the Supreme Court, but have also brought disgrace to this courthouse. Effective immediately, you are suspended from your duties pending a formal review. Hand over your badge and leave the premises. Haynes' face twisted with a mix of shame and disbelief. He reached for his badge with trembling hands, unfastening it from his uniform and holding it out to the judge as though it weighed 100 pounds. The murmurs in the hallway grew louder, the crowd watching in stunned silence as the officer turned and began the long, humiliating walk back down the hallway toward the exit. Anita watched him go, her expression unreadable. She felt no triumph in his downfall, only a deep weariness that came from knowing how many others like him still held positions of power, unchecked and unchallenged. Her work, she realized, was far from over. Judge Mason cleared his throat, drawing her attention back to him. Justice Carter, he said, his tone more formal now, I deeply regret what has occurred here today. Please know that this matter will be dealt with swiftly and appropriately. Anita nodded, her gaze softening slightly. I appreciate that, Judge Mason. But as I said, this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one, whether they hold a title like mine or not, has to endure the kind of treatment I experienced today. I trust you'll take steps to address the culture in this courthouse. The judge inclined his head in acknowledgement. You have my word. With that, Anita turned and began walking back toward the courtroom she had initially entered that morning. The crowd parted silently to let her pass, their faces a mixture of awe and newfound respect. Even those who hadn't recognized her name until this moment could see that she was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who demanded accountability not through loud proclamations but through unwavering resolve. As she entered the courtroom and took her seat once more, the whispers outside began to fade. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and Anita knew they wouldn't stop until the courthouse had been held to account. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, her focus returning to the cases being heard before her. The fight was far from over, but Anita Carter was more than ready for whatever came next. The courthouse, now buzzing with whispers of the incident, felt like it was holding its collective breath. Officer Haynes had stormed out of the building moments earlier, humiliated and stripped of his badge. Yet, even as his heavy boots faded down the hallway, the tension remained palpable. Anita Carter sat back in her chair in the courtroom, her face calm, her breathing steady, though beneath her composed exterior, her mind was sharp and calculating. She wasn't finished, not yet. This wasn't just about Haynes. His actions were merely a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive problem. Judge Mason, still standing in the hallway, exchanged brief words with his senior clerk before stepping into the courtroom. The room quieted as the weight of his presence filled the air. His expression was measured, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the moment. Without acknowledging the murmurs around him, he made his way to his bench and took a seat, his robes settling around him like a black tide. Anita watched him intently. She knew Mason well enough to understand that he was a man who valued order above all else. But what had transpired here today was chaos, and it would not go unnoticed. He cleared his throat, silencing the remaining whispers in the room. Before we proceed with today's cases, Judge Mason began, his voice steady but firm, I want to address the events that have unfolded within this courthouse. This morning, a series of actions were taken that were not only inappropriate, but entirely unacceptable. They have caused embarrassment not only to this institution, but to our entire judicial system. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, ensuring that every word landed with weight. Anita remained still, her expression inscrutable. Justice Carter Mason continued, turning his focus directly to her. I offer my deepest apologies on behalf of this courthouse for the treatment you endured. What happened to you is not reflective of the values we uphold, nor the respect that your position demands. The room was silent, the tension hanging like a thick fog. Anita nodded in acknowledgement, but her eyes carried a message that words did not need to convey. Apologies alone would not suffice. Mason hesitated, reading her unspoken challenge. He knew that this was not the end of the matter, but the beginning of something far more consequential. Your Honor. Ah, Anita said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I appreciate your apology. But what happened here today goes beyond one incident or one officer. It speaks to a culture, one that allows unchecked power and bias to thrive in an environment that should embody fairness and justice. The actions of Officer Haynes were not isolated. They were a symptom of a systemic issue, one that I believe requires immediate and decisive action. Judge Mason stiffened, though not out of disagreement. He had known Anita long enough to understand that she was a force of nature, and when she spoke with such conviction, it was impossible to dismiss her words. Still, he was unaccustomed to having his courtroom become a stage for such a confrontation, and the weight of her statement pressed heavily on his shoulders. Justice Carter Mason replied carefully, I assure you, this matter will be investigated thoroughly. I will personally oversee any necessary changes to ensure that. With respect, Judge Mason. Anita interrupted, her tone polite but unyielding. Thorough investigations and assurances are not enough. How many more people must endure what I endured today before action is taken? How many individuals without my authority or platform have been silenced, humiliated, or dismissed in this very building? The room collectively inhaled. Anita's words carried a quiet ferocity that sent a ripple through the assembled clerks, attorneys, and onlookers. Even Mason, who was not easily rattled, leaned back slightly in his chair, considering his response. I am not asking for platitudes, Anita continued, her voice unwavering. I am demanding accountability, not just for today, but for every injustice that has been swept under the rug. This courthouse must serve as a model for fairness and integrity, not as a breeding ground for unchecked abuse of power. Her words were met with a stunned silence. the weight of her conviction pressing down on everyone present. Mason steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful but serious. He knew Anita's reputation. She would not stop until real change was enacted, and to stand in her way was a losing battle. Before Mason could respond, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "She's right." All heads turned toward the source of the voice, revealing a younger court clerk who had stepped forward hesitantly. He looked nervous but determined, his hands clenched at his sides. "I've seen it happen," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "People being treated unfairly, being talked down to, being ignored. Not just by Officer Haynes but by others. We've all seen it. And we've all stayed quiet." The admission hung in the air, shocking some and confirming the suspicions of others. Anita turned to the young man, her gaze softening ever so slightly. She nodded, silently encouraging him to continue. "It's not just today," the clerk went on, his voice growing steadier. "It's been going on for years. People are afraid to speak up because they think nothing will change, or worse, that they'll lose their jobs. But if someone like her is standing up to it," he gestured toward Anita, "then maybe it's time we all did." The room erupted into murmurs, a wave of voices rising as others began to speak up, sharing their own experiences or offering their support. The walls of the courthouse, which had long been silent witnesses to countless injustices, now seemed to echo with the voices of those who had finally found the courage to speak. Judge Mason raised a hand, calling for order. The murmurs died down, but the energy in the room remained electric. He turned his attention back to Anita, his expression a mix of resignation and resolve. "Justice Carter," he said, his voice firm, "you have my word that this courthouse will not ignore your concerns. I will convene an emergency meeting with the Judicial Council to address the systemic issues you've raised, and I will personally ensure that changes are implemented, starting immediately." Anita inclined her head, acknowledging his commitment but remaining cautious. Words were easy, action was what mattered. "And one more thing," Mason added, turning to address the entire room. "To anyone who has witnessed or experienced misconduct within this courthouse, I urge you to come forward. This is your opportunity to be heard. There will be no retaliation for honesty, only accountability." The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, one by one, individuals began stepping forward, clerks, attorneys, even junior judges, each with their own stories to tell. What began as a single voice had grown into a chorus, a movement that could no longer be ignored. Anita watched it all unfold, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. This was why she had come here, not to expose one bad officer, but to confront the culture that allowed people like him to thrive. As the voices around her grew louder, she remained still, knowing that the hardest battles were still ahead. But for the first time that day, she allowed herself to believe that real change was possible, and she was ready to see it through. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from tense to electric. What had begun as a singular confrontation between Anita Carter and Officer Haynes had evolved into something far greater, a reckoning for the courthouse itself. The voices of clerks, attorneys, and even junior judges had merged into a wave of admissions, each one adding fuel to the fire Anita had sparked. These were not isolated grievances, but a tapestry of systemic issues that had festered for years. Anita stood at the center of it all, calm and resolute, her presence commanding yet understated. Judge Mason had called for order multiple times, his deep voice cutting through the rising clamor like a gavel striking steel. Slowly the room settled into silence once more, though the energy in the air remained palpable. Mason sat rigidly at his bench, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, as though they were the only thing anchoring him. He was a man who had prided himself on maintaining order in his courtroom, but today that control had slipped through his fingers. Anita watched him closely. She knew this moment was pivotal, not just for the courthouse but for him as well. Judge Mason had built his career on the principles of justice, but he now found himself presiding over a reckoning that threatened to expose the cracks in the very foundation of his domain. His reputation, his authority, and his legacy were on the line. Justice Carter Mason said finally, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. This courthouse owes you not only an apology but a commitment to real and lasting change. You have my word that every concern raised here today will be addressed with the utmost seriousness. Anita inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words without letting her guard down. Your Honor, she replied, her voice calm but carrying a weight that filled the room. Change begins with accountability. Words alone are not enough. The actions taken here in the coming days will determine whether this courthouse can truly embody the principles of justice it was built upon. Mason nodded, though his face betrayed the weight of the responsibility now placed squarely on his shoulders. You have my full support in ensuring that accountability, Justice Carter. But I would be remiss if I did not also acknowledge your own role in today's events. Your presence here, your actions, while justified, were unconventional. I hope you understand the magnitude of the impact you've made. Anita allowed herself a faint smile, though it was tempered by the gravity of the moment. I understand it all too well, Your Honor. But sometimes the only way to address systemic issues is to confront them head-on. If my actions today have shaken the foundation of this courthouse, then perhaps that's what was needed to ensure it can stand stronger in the future. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Mason leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as he considered her statement. He could find no fault in her logic, though it left him uneasy. Change was rarely comfortable, and the changes Anita demanded would require him to confront not only the failures of his courthouse, but his own complicity in allowing them to persist. Very well, Mason said at last, his tone resolute. Then let us begin that process immediately. I will convene a special session of the Judicial Council tomorrow morning to address the systemic concerns raised here today. In the meantime, I invite you, Justice Carter, to provide any additional recommendations you see fit. Thank you, Your Honor, Anita said simply. I will do so. The exchange might have seemed formal to an outsider, but to those in the room, it was a seismic moment. A Supreme Court justice had not only identified the flaws in the system, but had demanded their immediate correction, and the presiding judge had agreed to act. It was a moment of accountability that many had believed impossible, and yet here it was, unfolding before their eyes. But the climax of the day was far from over. Just as Judge Mason prepared to adjourn, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound echoed loudly in the now silent chamber, drawing every eye to the figure standing in the doorway. It was Officer Haynes, his face pale and his uniform rumpled from his hurried departure earlier. His badge was gone, his authority stripped, yet he stood there, as though clinging to the last shreds of his dignity. A murmur rippled through the room, shock and confusion mingling in equal measure. Anita turned slowly to face him, her expression unreadable. Judge Mason's face darkened, and he leaned forward, his voice sharp as a blade. Officer Haynes, Mason said, his tone laced with warning. You have been relieved of your duties and instructed to leave this courthouse. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Haynes hesitated, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. His eyes darted between Mason and Anita, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and desperation. Finally, he stepped forward, his voice trembling with emotion. I need to speak, he said, his words loud but shaky. I can't leave without saying something. Mason's frown deepened, but he gestured for silence as murmurs broke out again. You will speak only if Justice Carter permits it, he said coldly. All eyes turned to Anita. She regarded Haynes for a long moment, her face betraying no hint of what she was thinking. Finally, she gave a small nod. Very well, she said. Say what you need to say. Haynes swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. He took another step forward, his eyes locking onto Anita's with a mixture of defiance and something else, something almost like shame. I was wrong, he said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. I acted out of line. I let my temper and my assumptions get the better of me, and I overstepped. I know that, but he hesitated, his voice breaking slightly. But I'm not the only one. This system, this courthouse, it's built to protect people like me, people who think they can do whatever they want because no one ever questions it. And I've taken advantage of that. The room was utterly silent. Even Judge Mason seemed taken aback by the rawness of Haynes' admission. Anita remained still, her gaze fixed on him as he continued. I don't expect forgiveness, Haynes said, his voice quieter now. And I know I'll probably never wear this uniform again. But if what happened today means that people like me, people who abuse their power, get held accountable, then maybe it's worth it. He stopped, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of his words had drained him. The silence that followed was deafening, every person in the room processing what they had just heard. Finally, Anita spoke, her voice soft but unyielding. Accountability begins with acknowledgement, she said. But it doesn't end there. Words are not enough. If you are sincere in what you've said, Officer Haynes, then I hope you will commit to actions that reflect that sincerity. The road to redemption is long, and it is not guaranteed, but it is never too late to start. Haynes nodded slowly, his eyes brimming with emotion. Without another word, he turned and left the courtroom, the heavy doors closing behind him with a finality that seemed to echo the end of an era. Anita turned back to Judge Mason, her composure unbroken. Let us ensure that his words are not in vain, she said. This courthouse must lead by example. Mason nodded, his face grim but resolute. It will. With that, the gavel struck, signaling the end of the session. But for Anita, the work had only just begun. As the room emptied, she stood for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle over her. Change was never easy, but it was always worth fighting for. And she would fight until the system she had dedicated her life to was one of justice, not just in name, but in action. The courthouse stood eerily quiet after the events of the day, the echoes of voices and confrontations lingering like the ghosts of a storm now past. Anita Carter, Supreme Court Justice, walked calmly through the corridors, her sharp gaze taking in the details around her, the faded paint on the walls, the stacks of neglected paperwork on desks, and the wary expressions of the courthouse staff who avoided meeting her eyes. Each detail told a story, each face a reflection of the culture she had confronted and vowed to change. The Judicial Council convened early the next morning in a solemn, wood-paneled conference room on the top floor of the courthouse. The room smelled faintly of old varnish and coffee, a place where decisions with far-reaching consequences were made daily. Today, however, it was Anita who set the agenda. The council members sat around the table, their faces a mix of unease and determination. Judge Mason presided at the head of the table, his expression grim but focused. Anita sat directly across from him, poised and calm, her hands resting lightly on a folder containing detailed notes from her observations. The air was heavy with anticipation. Every individual present understood that this meeting was no mere formality. And thank you all for coming on such short notice, Judge Mason began, his deep voice steady but lacking its usual authority. As you are all aware, yesterday's events revealed significant issues within our courthouse operations, issues that cannot and will not be ignored. He gestured toward Anita. Justice Carter has graciously offered to share her insights and recommendations. I suggest we listen carefully and take her words to heart. Anita inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. She stood, her presence commanding without being overbearing. The room fell silent as she opened her folder and began speaking. "Thank you, Judge Mason," she said, her voice measured and deliberate. "What I witnessed yesterday was not an isolated incident, nor is it unique to this courthouse. It is indicative of a deeper, systemic problem, one that extends beyond individual misconduct and speaks to a culture that tolerates, and in some cases enables, abuses of power." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. The behavior of Officer Haynes was reprehensible, but it did not exist in a vacuum. He acted as he did because the system around him allowed it, because no one held him accountable, because no one challenged the underlying biases that informed his actions. If we are to move forward, we must address not only the symptoms but the disease itself. The council members shifted in their seats, some nodding in agreement while others avoided her gaze. Anita continued, her tone unwavering. "My recommendations are as follows," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "First, this courthouse must implement mandatory bias training for all staff, from security personnel to judges. It is not enough to assume that those who work within the justice system are inherently fair or impartial. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, must be confronted and corrected." She placed a hand on the folder before her. "Second, there must be a clear and transparent system for reporting misconduct, one that protects whistleblowers from retaliation. Too often, those who speak out are silenced, and that silence allows misconduct to fester. We must create an environment where accountability is not only encouraged but expected." Anita's gaze sharpened, her tone taking on an edge. "Finally, there must be consequences for those who abuse their power. Officer Haynes was suspended, but suspension is not enough. His actions warrant a full investigation and, if necessary, legal action. This courthouse must send a clear message that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it." The room remained silent as Anita concluded her remarks, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. Judge Mason cleared his throat, his expression thoughtful. "Justice Carter," he said, his voice carrying a note of respect, "your recommendations are thorough and, in my opinion, absolutely necessary. I will ensure that they are implemented immediately." However, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I would also like to hear from the other members of this council. Does anyone wish to speak?" A junior judge, a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and an air of quiet determination, raised her hand. "I'd like to add something," she said, her voice steady. "What Justice Carter witnessed yesterday is something many of us have observed for years, but lacked the authority or courage to address. Her presence here has given us an opportunity, a mandate, even to enact the changes we've long known were necessary. We cannot waste this moment." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from around the table. Others began to speak, their voices growing more confident as they shared their own observations and experiences. The meeting stretched on for hours, evolving from a grim reckoning into a collaborative effort to reshape the courthouse's culture. By the time the meeting adjourned, the council had adopted Anita's recommendations unanimously. Plans were set in motion to overhaul training programs, establish new reporting mechanisms, and conduct a comprehensive review of courthouse policies. It was a beginning, not a solution, but a step toward one. Anita left the conference room feeling a rare sense of cautious optimism. As she descended the courthouse steps, she was approached by the young clerk who had spoken up during the confrontation with Haynes. He looked nervous but resolute, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Justice Carter," he began, his voice faltering slightly. "I just wanted to thank you for speaking up, for standing your ground, for making us all realize that we have a voice too." Anita studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You don't need to thank me," she said gently. "The courage you showed yesterday speaking out when it would have been easier to stay silent, that's what drives change. Never underestimate the power of your voice." The clerk nodded, a flicker of pride lighting his face. He stepped aside as Anita continued down the steps, her heels clicking softly against the stone. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the courthouse plaza, but Anita felt no darkness in her path. Instead, she felt the weight of responsibility, a burden she had carried for years, but one she was willing to bear for as long as it took. She reached the edge of the plaza and paused, looking back at the courthouse. It stood as it always had, solid and imposing, but Anita knew that something fundamental had shifted within its walls. The wheels of justice, long clogged with inertia, had begun to turn again. It would take time, effort, and vigilance to keep them moving, but Anita was ready for the fight. With a final glance, she turned and walked away, her steps confident and her resolve unshaken. Change was coming not just to the courthouse, but to the system it represented, and Anita Carter would be there every step of the way, ensuring that justice, true justice, became more than just a word. It would become a reality.